Today's reading is from Martha Graham. She writes, "There is a vitality, a life force, energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there is only one of you in all of time, this expression is unique. And if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium, and it will be lost. The world will not have it. It is not your business to determine how good it is, nor how valuable, nor how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours, clearly and directly to keep the channel open. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. You have to keep yourself open and aware to the urges that motivate you. Keep the channel open."
Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Bill. So can you hear me through this mic okay? It's working? Okay, good. Michael, thank you. Wasn't sure what song you might be coming out. So that's a great one. And Janelle, thank you. Thank you for the reading and also for the prayer. And Dusty, thank you for an invitation to be here. It's great to see all of you. I see some faces I haven't seen in a long time. For some, it's been a few months, and for some, it's been a long time. One, I think maybe she was 10. Now she's 19. I mean, what's happened? What's going on? And so happy Father's Day. I hope it's a great Father's Day for you. You know, Father's Day is sort of a mixed bag. And most of those holidays that call for us to feel certain things, most of those holidays it could be great, or sometimes it's not so great. And so I hope that your Father's Day is a good one. I think the reason for that is because life is complex. And so if life is complex and people are complex, then naturally our holidays are going to be sort of complex too at times. This talk is what I call a combination talk. And that means I'm doing two things at the same time. It may look to you like I'm doing one, but I'm actually doing two. And that is because, Bruce, this is Father's Day. So I talk a little bit about fathers. And then my official title is going to be Creating Meaningful Conversations. And so that's the official title. And putting those two things together it was actually pretty easy because both of them fit together, at least in my head they do. And so I should ask the question as I start, did you have meaningful conversations with your dad? Or if your dad happens to still be in the physical, do you have meaningful conversations with your dad? And so it's something that we might want to pause and think about, and we may have very different answers to that question. And then I want to broaden the question out and just simply ask, when's the last time you had a meaningful conversation with anybody, with someone? Because having a meaningful conversation is really important, don't you think? I mean, that's what we're going to think about for the next 25 minutes or so. And so give some thought to it because it's an important thing to do. You could have conversations and not really have a connection. But if you're going to have a real connection, you're going to have some meaningful conversations sooner or later. Not only with your father, not only with a mother, but with just people. And people you may want to have a relationship with in some way. You know, thinking about doing the talk, of course, I thought about my dad quite a bit, and that's one thing I wish. Sometimes we have do-overs, and we think, I wish I could do that over again. And do you hear a bird, or is that just me? It could be in my head. I mean, at my age, you hear all kinds of things. So I wish I could have had more meaningful conversations with my dad. And with my mom, too. Meaningful conversations, what does that mean? For me, it means talking about things that really matter. It's not chit-chat, but it's talking about something that's deep, And a lot of times we don't do so much of that. A lot of times we just deal with surface things. We talk about the weather. We talk about the latest ball game. We talk about, what do you want to have for lunch? And so a meaningful conversation probably goes beyond those kinds of things, because meaningful conversations, they happen when hearts touch and when you actually feel emotion and you feel something during the conversation. And so it involves talking, it involves listening, and it involves words. Some of us like to use words. I'm a talker, so I like to use words, but some people are not talkers. And so with a conversation, you're going to have words and maybe even turn those words into sentences. And so it takes communication with your mouth. And as I've gotten older, I believe now in the power of connection with other human beings, I think more than I've ever believed it in my whole life. I used to think that, and I would have said it, and I probably said it here before, I've thought of myself as a loner. And I don't want to be that anymore. I don't want to be a loner anymore. And the truth is, I probably never was. The truth is, I probably just said it because in my head, it sounded like the thing to say. But we were not built, none of us were built to really be loners. There's an epidemic of loneliness taking place. And maybe it's always been that way, but doing some reading over the last couple of weeks, I think that it at least seems to me to be growing. My dad used to call me, and he would have what I would consider vulnerable conversations with me. And that's unusual for a man of his generation, because he's a guy. I mean, he's a man. He's the kind of guy that wouldn't do that kind of thing, but he did. And so he would call me and he would talk about feeling lonely. He would talk about feeling isolated. And he would talk about being depressed. And he would say, do you ever get lonely? Do you ever feel depressed? Now, loneliness and depression aren't the same thing, but they seem to sort of grow out of the same vicinity to me. I looked at some old emails because I remembered getting something back in Journey's days, getting a little note from a friend of mine. Because I was doing a talk, and the name of the talk was A Loneliness Plan. And so I remembered that, and so I pulled up his note. And I want to share that note with you. He said, "Hey, preach." And that used to irritate me. He would call me that all the time. And, that's a weird thing to be calling someone. But he's a great guy. And he said, "Hey, preach. So you're going to talk about a loneliness plan next Sunday. I wondered if you'd like some thoughts from an expert. Your note says there's a great gulf between being alone and being lonely. True enough. In fact, they aren't the same thing at all. They're not even related. A person can be alone without being lonely, and they can be miserably lonely and still not be alone. He says, alone is a state of mind. Lonely is a state of the heart. Alone is very often something that one chooses for oneself. It can be for peace and quiet, a time for contemplation and introspection, a regrouping of inner resources. Loneliness is a craving of the spirit for connection. And when it happens in conjunction with alone, the results are devastating. It is a need to be touched, so you know you're alive. It is a need to be acknowledged so that you know that you are real. Loneliness is an empty depression of the soul that can't be alleviated by saying, well, just get through it. Pull up your socks, hang in there, it will get better. So I'm wondering what you might say about this on Sunday. As always, looking forward to a story or two. Keep in mind, a lot of people are listening. Lots of lonely people out there. Isn't there a song that says that by some little musical group that you mentioned the other day? And he was talking, of course, about the Beatles when he said that. And I remember being deeply moved by the note, and I'm still moved by it, especially when I read through it the first time I looked it up this week, thinking about him. Now, I'm not a man who has spent a lot of time alone. I grew up an only child, and so I know what it is to be alone, but I spent most of my time in the mountains surrounded by life. And so I don't really remember as a kid feeling too lonely. And I remember my mom saying, "Would you like a brother or a sister?" And I think my typical response was, "No, I'm fine." And so, I don't remember that. And as an adult, I probably have spent more time in relationships than out of relationships. I don't think I've lived completely alone for probably more than 8 or 9 months at a time. And but I know about loneliness, because it's just like my friend said, alone and lonely are not the same thing. You can be with lots of people, and you can be with children and adults and still feel very much alone. Now, there's nothing wrong at all in being alone. Many people choose to be alone. And being alone, you can find beautiful, deep solitude and wisdom. And so there's nothing at all negative about being alone. But living alone, and it doesn't mean that you're lonely. Some people could be alone and not be lonely whatsoever. There may be some lonely moments, but there's lonely moments for everything we're doing. And so loneliness can affect everybody, and often does in one way or the other, whether people are in relationships or out of relationships. Last year, the British government appointed a minister of loneliness. See, that's interesting. Now, Stephen Colbert had a lot of jokes about that. But it's really not a funny thing. A recent study indicated that 9 million Brits suffer from loneliness. And a third of what they call elderly people reported being overwhelmed by loneliness. And just that word, see, touches me, overwhelmed by it. I read a book called Lonely America, Drifting Apart in the 21st Century. And it cited a study that was done at Duke University, which stated that between 1985 and 2004, the number of people with whom the average American discussed important matters dropped from 3 to 2. Then it said the number tripled that said they discussed important matters with absolutely no one. And 1/3 of the population today lives alone. Again, living alone is a fine thing to do, but it can set people up for pain at times. From the perspective of evolutionary psychology and from neuropsychology of attachment, and this is a quote from a book, human beings must have healthy attachments to survive and thrive. Must have in order to survive and thrive. When I was a kid, and I guess they still do this, but they line you all up and they're going to choose teams. And sometimes they didn't choose me first. And then sometimes they'd get even to higher numbers, and I'm still standing there. I didn't like that. I didn't like it. And I remember thinking, why is that happening? Because it seemed to me to be more about personality than it did about ability. But it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to not be chosen. And it doesn't feel good even as adults to be left out. And so when we have that feeling of being left out, it creates a disruption in our psychological makeup. And I've talked to a lot of people, and just in conversations with people have told me enough that I realize that sometimes that disruption in our psychological system remains for years, because adults tell me of things that happened when they were 6 and when they were 7 and when they were 8. Social scientists tell us that when we are snubbed as children or adults, we become more aggressive. We become more rigid and we become more set in our ways, and we want it to be the way we want it to be. And sometimes that's not the best way to be in a relationship. Social scientists said the following. We feel when we, let me give you the sentence. When we feel left out, when we feel snubbed, we feel isolated. We choose self-defeating behaviors. We avoid meaningful thought. It seems as if time slows down and compassion for others disappears. And this is what caught my attention, and we have very few meaningful conversations. And so feeling like we don't belong somewhere is hard for people. But I tell you what's the hardest thing. The hardest thing is not having the courage and the words to be able to tell someone. Not having the words and the courage to tell someone your deepest feelings and your deepest needs. And so I'll say it for you in case you don't want to say it. I'll say it for you right now. And that is that loneliness is a craving of our soul, our spirit, for connection with other people. Thomas More was a former priest and a psychotherapist, and he wrote a book some years ago called Care of the Soul. Many of you probably have read that book. And he argues that the complaints that we make about life, including those about loneliness, are symptoms of soul pain. And instead of dealing with one symptom at a time, he says a better approach is to turn inside and go to the center of our soul and work outward. And so specifically, he suggests that the desire for community, the desire to connect with another human being, the desire to let go of loneliness, he says, is soul work of the highest order. You know, Barbara saying, people who need people are the luckiest people in the world. And I suspect she is exactly right about that, because we need that kind of connection. One of the strongest needs we all have is tribal in nature. And so we long for intimacy. We long for friendship. We long for connection. But real intimacy is scary to most people because it's hard to get it going. And some people would say it's even harder to maintain it because true intimacy, if it's real, knows few limits and few boundaries. And that gives us pause because we like some boundaries. We like a wall so we can hide behind it. We can sneak over occasionally, but we still like to be able to hide behind something. And so we are paradoxical humans, you and I, because it's like walking a tightrope. It's like we're wanting to live in this world, but we also want to live in that world as well. And so I long for connection. I feel the need for intimacy, but I demand degrees of privacy and independence. And I'm not so different from you, because that's how human beings are. We're independent and private. We like that, but we are storytellers by nature. I like to tell my story. And at the end of the day, we'd like to tell the story to somebody because that helps us make sense of our lives in some way. But to tell stories, you need a listener, and you'd like to think you're with a listener who at least cares about your ramblings. And so you can see the problem there, because you're wanting to share and retell that story of what happened today. But if they ask too many questions, you may begin to back up and put up another brick wall. Because one of our deepest needs as human beings, one of the deepest needs we have is for solitude and safety. But then one of our deep, deep social needs is that we want to be connected in some way. So it's like a continuum, and I always like continuums. You know, you're over there and then you could be over there. You can be in any place, and so you're all the way in between, and you can choose where you're going to be. And so loneliness is the result of balancing too far into privacy and independence, and you feel lonely. But if you move too far the other direction, there's a loss of self and a loss of identity. You no longer know who you are, and you feel like everybody is in charge of your life except you. So both possibilities are scary. So we have to somehow balance ourselves in between. Thomas More said in his book, he says, we have a great need for protection, and all of us know that. And so we build walls, but in our walls we block true community. And he tells a story about a lady who was plagued, and he says racked with the pain of loneliness. And in telling the story, he says that she had structures built in her mind of the ideal friendship, the perfect friendship. And she was so in love with her idea of the perfect friendship that she wouldn't allow anybody to get close to her. And so that's sort of the price. We want to be safe, and yet if we go too far in that direction, we may end up not feeling so good about life and about ourselves. Now, I'm in the habit, if I'm speaking, I always want to try to be helpful. Don't want to do harm, but I'd like to be helpful. And so I suppose I should ask the question, how do you get unlonely? Well, I'm glad you asked. But Moore says that's not a good question to ask. He says because loneliness is dealing with symptoms. And he says it's dealing with soul work. And so he says whatever you do with emotional pain, instead of dealing with the symptoms, he suggests we go within, we go inside, and we actually seek spirit within ourselves. And so he says that's the launching pad, that's the platform, that's the foundation to live from. And I think that makes lots of sense to me. And so we can begin with that idea. The foundation is spiritual. So that's where we're going to build on. But I still ask the question, well, what can I do to become a little less lonely? What can I do to really build beautiful relationships? Let me suggest, I like numbers, so I'll give you a few. So you'll know how far I am and how far I'm going and when I'll be done. I'm going to give you 5 ideas. They're quick, Carol. And so idea number 1 is you'd want to make peace with yourself. My dad used to say to me, he would introduce me to somebody, and he would say, you know, this is Billy, and he did this and that, and he's a good egg. And that's kind of sweet. He's a good egg. And I didn't know what that meant, but I thought, well, it seems positive, so I suppose it's a good thing. And so you want to be a good egg. You want to think of yourself in those terms. Or maybe you can say it another way. You want to love yourself. You want to feel good about yourself. Because if you haven't connected with the core of who you are, if you haven't embraced the beauty that you are, it's hard to embrace the core of someone else. And so sometimes counseling helps, sometimes coaching helps, sometimes just talking to a friend can help. But that's a good place to begin. You begin with a spiritual foundation, and you begin by making peace with yourself. And the second thing that I would suggest is maybe you got to be a little bit more courageous. You got to be brave. You got to be brave, and you've got to be courageous, and you've got to take a risk. Because if your wall is large, if your wall is strong enough, and I know you've been hurt before. I mean, every human being in here, you've been hurt before, and with every pain, you put another brick in the wall, right? And we keep building, and soon we're all hiding. You know, even when we come to a place like this, we come together and we walk in and we say hi and we hug each other even during the service, and we're loving each other, but sometimes it feels like we are eggs. Eggs, get it? Eggs, good eggs, eggs. Like we're eggs and we're clicking our shells together. See, now it just came to me. See how ideas just come. And so we're clicking our shells together, but not really touching. And so if loneliness is your constant companion, you might think of it as a telephone call. It's a calling. When pain happens, what we want to do is run. some Buddhists suggest what we want to do is move closer. We want to move closer and we want to ask, who's hurting exactly? Where is this pain happening? And so it's a calling to go deeper. And you may decide to tear the wall down just a bit. In order to be loved, we must find ways to love. In order to be a friend or to have friends, you want to be a friend. You've heard that. And in order to find engagement, we want to do that. And so that means we want to start building bridges to people. Otherwise, we can't reach people. But that does take courage. It requires courage because sometimes we get hurt. Sometimes we get hurt. And if we just live in that hurt, nothing ever changes. And we almost blow this incarnation because we're hiding inside of hurt. So we want to climb out of that. We want to be brave. This is just a game anyway. This is the incarnational game of life. You're a spiritual being. You live forever, and you're in this body just for a short time. And so let's climb out of the shell and try it. Oh, you get slapped around a bit. You get hurt, and you fall down. You get back up, and you do it again. You do it again. When I was a little kid, I had a horse accident, my fault totally, and the horse actually stepped on me just a bit and had to go to the hospital, and I, was in trouble and could have died. And when I came back home, and maybe a week or two had passed, and I wasn't so sore, my dad said, "You need to get back on the horse." And I understood that even at like 5 years old. I understood because if you didn't get back on the horse, you'd never get on the horse again. And so the same thing is true in relationships. If you get hurt, you want to get back up and continue with that. Brené Brown is the expert on vulnerability. And she says vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, courage, and empathy. So nobody likes pain. But I'd encourage you, take a chance. Take a chance. Throw the dice and see what happens. Yeah, but the last time, we can't be focused on the last time. We learned the lesson from the last time, and now let's throw the dice and keep moving, because I can tell you for sure, guardedness doesn't work. It doesn't work. You're not built for that. Michael Singer was asked, in his book, Untethered Soul, somebody said, or he had someone asking, well, how do you keep your heart open? And he gave the honest, clear answer, by not closing it. And so we make peace with ourselves. We're brave enough to take a chance. We keep our hearts open. And number 3, we try genuine connection. I was in the bookstore maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, and I picked up a book called Lost Connection. It's by John Herd. I don't know if any of you see that book? Lost Connections. And it's a great book, very interesting, insightful book. And he talks about loneliness and depression. As a teenager, he's talking to the doctor. And he said, I like his description. He said, I sort of feel like pain is just leaking out of me. You ever feel that way? And so I can't regulate it. I don't know what I'm going to do. And the doctor said, oh, well, you've got low serotonin. And serotonin is what makes you feel good. And so all we got to do is give you this antidepressant. And when you take it, you'll get serotonin back within 2-3 weeks, and you'll feel good again. And so he gave him that. And in less than a month, he said he felt better. But then a few months went by, and then he said the depression and the loneliness, in his case, came back. And that's what the research indicates. Research indicates 65 to 80% of the people who take antidepressants may, down the road, feel depressed again. Now, lots of people are taking antidepressants, and I'm in favor of anything that helps. I mean, I'll just go on record. If something's helping you, then I'm in favor of it. And I don't want to be too intimate with you, but, in 1990, without antidepressants, I probably would be dead. So I'm thankful for those antidepressants that I had for a year. 1 in 5 of us is taking a psychiatric drug. You want to look around and see? No. Don't need that. 1 in 3 women during their lifetime will take antidepressants. 15.5 million Americans have been taking antidepressants for more than 5 years. And that number has tripled since 2000. The U.S. suicide rate increased 25% from 1997 up to 2019. Well, in this book, The Lost Connection, he gives 9 primary reasons for loneliness, and he lumps them together, and depression. 2 of them are physical, but the others are connected to something he calls disconnection from people. Sometimes it involves work, sometimes it involves friendship, sometimes it involves love, but it's losing your connection with other people. And he says in the book, quote, we require tribe. We require belonging to a group because we have 3 words, an innate psychological need. And so depression or loneliness is simply a signal that your need isn't being met. Now for me, that's encouraging because that means, oh, I've got a need. You see, there's nothing severely wrong. You're functioning just like a normal human being would function without connection. See, that's good news because you can do something about that. It's always good when, well, we can do something about it. He said, and this is a quote, he said, we require reconnection with the mansions of life. That's what he called it. He meant the big things of life. And then he gives a list of them. Other people, intimacy, connection, and meaningful conversations. Conversations that are filled with meaning. And he says we need a tribe. I'm big on tribe. Here's the definition of tribe. See if you're in one. A tribe is a collective of people who live in a spirit of love and acceptance. You, if you come here on a regular basis or even a semi-regular basis, probably feel that here. A spirit of love and acceptance with people who are committed to a larger purpose than just themselves. Miracles happen in tribes. Sometimes a miracle will happen if you're living in a cave. But miracles especially happen in relationship. And it's where you have a safe place to talk about what really matters. And so I suggest number 3, choose connection. You got them? Number 1, start with yourself. Number 2, take the risk. Number 3, choose connection. And number 4, and I used to say this to my sons, use your words. You know, they would be pounding each other with a stick, and I would say, use your words. And so it would do us well to use our words and to take our words and turn them into sentences and communicate. You can say, well, I think nice things, but it's good to say the nice things. Words carry energy. If you don't listen to anything else I say, listen to this, because this is the best part. It may seem a little boring to you. Don't know if it will or not, but this is the most important part. Words carry energy. Words carry like a bucket. They carry emotion. Academics who study language tell us that words have meaning, and the underlying meaning they call frames. And so we have psychological frames that are that we use in our minds. And those frames, if you imagine a frame is something you're looking through, like a pair of glasses, those frames, those words determine what you see when you look at the world, what you see when you look at people, and what you see when you look at yourself. You may look at someone and feel nothing. But if you take a negative word and you see it through that negative word, it becomes very negative. If you take a positive word and look through that frame, then everything changes. And so meaningful conversations are essential to humanity. There was a reporter, I was going to tell you this, but So I don't remember his name, but there was a reporter traveling in Africa. And he'd been traveling for a couple of weeks, and he's traveling all around. And he said he noticed people that sometimes on the Serengeti, and they would be back, Dusty probably been there. And so there are people out there, and they're traveling, and you hardly ever see a human being. I mean, they're 20 miles apart in some cases. And so he would witness, one person would come along, another person would come along, and they would come close and put their heads together. One would say something, and the other one would say something, and then they'd walk away and go on their way. And so finally he asked his guide, what are those people saying? What are they doing? And he said, well, it's a tradition that we have here. It's something that everybody does. And so the first person in their native language says, they come together, and the person looks at the other person, looks them in the eye, and they say, I see you. And the other person says, I am here. I'm present. I'm here. And it's almost implied, because the order is important, it's almost implied because the person is seeing, they become present. See, that's talking about relationships. And so meaningful conversations are created with words when you connect. We are, as someone said years ago, we are linguistically constructed. That's how we're built. And so with the words that you use, you create your identity. Your words really matter. The words you use create your relationships. And I want to tell you one other thing, and I said this is the important part, but this is really the important part. Meaningful conversations are created by, ready? That's a drum roll. Meaningful conversations are created by meaningful questions. Now that's a holy statement. And what that means is it's so important you can't leave it to chance. I suggest you design the questions you're going to ask. You can Google questions to build relationships, and lots of articles will pop up and give you specific questions, because now we know the questions that create deep relationships. And so you Google those and you practice. I do relationship coaching, and in relationship coaching, I encourage couples who want to build their relationship to meet together once a week and just for an hour have a deep conversation. And you can just use questions that you already designed to do it. And so you can't leave it to chance. If you don't choose the questions, then the conversations probably will not take place. And if you don't have a time to have these conversations, they probably will not take place. And so you set a day, maybe Friday. You take an hour and you sit down, no television, no phones, you turn everything off, and you have a deep conversations. What kind of questions are you talking about, Bill? Well, questions like this, like with couples, the first thing you would say is, what are 3 things you're really grateful for this week? And then the other person just talks about it. You might say, and some of you men will not like this maybe, I don't know, it may make you nervous, so I'll tell you anyway, but one question that couples would ask would be, how would you rate our love life on a scale 1 to 10? And if, the person can say anything you want. And then the next question is, how could we make it a 10 for this week? And so it's very practical. You can ask other questions like, what do you miss about being a kid? Or what's your favorite family holiday? Or who's someone you really admire? Or if you had 26 hours in a day, what would you like more of? What do you think about most of the time? Have a conversation. And they're all over the internet. And the reason that's so important is because change begins when you ask a question. A question is a vehicle. It's a vehicle, and we don't know that. And so we just ask some questions that take us to hell often. Because if you ask a question, no question is neutral. Every question is a leading question. And it's going to lead you somewhere. It's going to either lead you to paradise or lead you someplace else. And so you want to ask in your own mind, where is this question going to take us? And you want to ask questions that will take you to someplace beautiful. Because when you ask those kinds of questions, you're going to have a meaningful conversation. And when you have a meaningful conversation, you have just this beautiful, intimate connection with another human being. And your heart just opens and every cell of your body celebrates this life. It's important. And you know how it all begins? You Googling some questions and saying, let's talk about something important. It's important. And then my final point, and it's a quick one, so you got to pay attention. Number 5, just like you want your foundation to be spiritual, you want your foundation to be gratitude. You want to be grateful. You want to ask every day. You know, every time I read about gratitude, and I've read about it in lots of books and lots of articles, all of them talk about the practice of gratitude. It's not just the talk of gratitude, but it's the practice of gratitude. And so people, with Oprah, remember she said at morning and at night she would write down 3 things or 6 things she was grateful for. And that's not just a little game. It really does have a lasting effect in your life. And if you're coming from gratitude, you will find it much easier to have meaningful conversations because it fills you up in such a way that you have something beautiful to share. And so simply saying, this day I'm thankful for. And you feel that. And it's important. You can't just write it. You can't just think about it, but you want to feel it. You want to write it, and you want it to ooze through your body. And it gives you a new lens to see everything. Years ago, a guy wasn't really a friend, but a guy said he had worked in New York City on skyscrapers. And he said it's really important not to lean against the wind. Because if you're leaning against the wind and the wind stops, you fall. And so I want to suggest not leaning against the wind, but I'm going to suggest when you have a choice, and you always do, my mother told me, you always have a choice, as I'd explain why I did such and such, I had no choice. She said, you always have a choice, and you always have a choice. So when it comes down to a choice, choose to lean into gratitude. Choose to lean into vulnerability. Choose to lean into taking a chance. Choose because you understand that you are worthy. And so much of everything we are, so much of every single relationship we have is created continually by significant conversations we have with other people and with ourselves. So with that in mind, let's pray together. So please turn with me. We as a community in this moment, we make an agreement with ourselves and with all that is, and we choose gratitude, knowing that that's going to help us see good in life, and it's going to help us to see good in people, and it's going to help us to see good in ourselves. We choose gratitude. And we choose our words and sentences with wisdom. We, from this day forward, choose questions knowing they're going to lead us somewhere. And so we ask questions like, who am I thankful for right now? Who do I love right now? In this big world, who cares about me right now? What gives me joy? What am I excited about? And what's the most beautiful memory I have with you? We ask beautiful questions. And we choose to connect with other people, not just clicking shells. And we choose to be so brave that we would actually trust people. Because we are brave. We are courageous. And so we take the risk. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. We didn't come for a holiday as spiritual beings. We came to have a human experience. A human experience. Some days the sun is shining and some days it's not. But we came to have a human experience. And what makes that human experience amazing is connection with other humans. And so we are eternal. We are beauty. We are wisdom. We in this place are tribe. We are tribe. And it's up to each of us to express that to each other. We actually can look into one another's eyes today and hug one another, and we can say beautiful words to one another, and we can even ask beautiful questions like, what are you excited about this week? And just listen to the answers. What are you looking forward to this week? What do you love about today? And the beloved community all said together, and so it is. Thank you.